The Texas sun sank low behind the distant hills, washing the plains in a burning orange haze as dust drifted lazily through the air. Thomas Hale, a rugged rancher with years of wind and grit carved into his face, rode his weary horse down the narrow trail that led to the creek behind his property. It had been a punishing summer, no rain for weeks. The soil cracked like broken glass, and his cattle thin from thirst. Water was life now, and every drop felt more precious than gold. When he reached the creek, he dismounted, letting his horse lower its head to drink while he knelt to refill his canteen. That's when he saw something strange on the far bank, a shape half buried in the reeds, unmoving. At first, he thought it was an old coat or torn saddle blanket washed downstream. But as he squinted against the dying light, a chill crept up his spine. It was a man. Thomas crossed the shallow water carefully, hand brushing the grip of his revolver, boots sinking into the soft mud. The figure was young, maybe mid-20s, skin bronzed by the sun and marked with dirt and blood. An arrow jutted from his shoulder, its shaft snapped in two. His chest rose weakly with each shallow breath. Thomas froze when he realized the man was a native. Apache, maybe, judging by the beaded necklace at his throat. Stories of raids and revenge whispered through his mind, neighbors' ranches burned, travelers ambushed, men disappearing without a trace. A wounded Apache on his land could mean danger, a sign that others weren't far behind. He glanced around the horizon, just open plains, silent and endless, no movement except a hawk circling high above. He could walk away, pretend he hadn't seen anything. No one would ever know. But as he looked down again, something shifted inside him. Beneath the grime and blood, the young man's face wasn't that of an enemy, was that of a human being, scared, hurting, and alone. Thomas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as the evening breeze carried a faint scent of rain that would never come. "Damn it, boy," he muttered under his breath. He holstered his pistol, crouched beside the wounded stranger, and pulled out his canteen. The man stirred faintly, eyelids fluttering open, just enough to reveal eyes as dark and deep as the night itself. Thomas lifted his head gently, pressing the canteen to his cracked lips. "Drink," he said softly. The man obeyed, coughing and gasping as the water hit his parched throat. But then he drank again, grateful. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the wind whispered through the grass, and the fading sun dipped below the horizon. When the canteen was empty, Thomas looked toward the distant silhouette of his ranch, the barn just a faint shape in the fading light. He knew what he had to do, even if it was foolish. He couldn't leave the man there to die. With a grunt, he lifted the wounded native carefully over his shoulder, feeling the man's weak breath against his neck. The horse neighed, uneasily, sensing Thomas's hesitation. "Easy, girl," he murmured, securing the man across the saddle. "We'll figure this out." As he led the horse back toward home, the sky turned purple, and the first stars began to pierce the twilight. Somewhere out in the darkness, a distant coyote howled. Thomas didn't look back, but if he had, he might have seen the faint glimmer of movement far beyond the hills, where unseen eyes watched him lead their fallen brother away. The ranch was quiet when Thomas returned, the night air cool and heavy with the scent of dry earth. The only sounds were the distant rustle of grass and the soft creak of the windmill turning in the dark. He led his horse into the small barn, its lantern casting a pale glow across the wooden beams. The wounded native hung limp across the saddle, barely conscious. Thomas eased him down carefully, grunting under the man's weight, and laid him on a pile of old hay near the stable wall. For a long moment, he just stood there, breathing hard, unsure what he'd just brought into his life. Helping a wounded Apache was the kind of thing that could get a man killed or worse, marked as a traitor among his neighbors. But when he looked at the young man again, pale and shaking with fever, the fear faded into something else: duty. Thomas fetched a bucket of clean water, a few rags, and the small tin of whiskey he kept for emergencies. He had no doctor's training, just years of patching up horses and the occasional ranch hand. The arrow wound was bad deep, the flesh torn and blackened with dirt. He broke the arrow's shaft, poured whiskey over the wound, and the young man stirred, gasping in pain. "Easy," Thomas muttered, holding him still. "Ain't trying to hurt you, son." He wrapped the shoulder tightly with clean cloth, then gave him another sip of water before covering him with an old wool blanket. The man's eyes fluttered open for a second, dark, distant, and full of mistrust. His lips moved slightly, a few words escaping in a language Thomas couldn't understand. Then his head dropped back, lost again to unconsciousness. Thomas sat back against a wooden post, rubbing his temples. "What the hell have I done?" he whispered. Outside, the coyotes cried again, and the horses shifted nervously in their stalls. Somewhere out there, he thought, someone would be looking for this man. A brother, a friend, or a whole damn war party. Hours passed before sleep finally took him. When morning came, the barn was bathed in soft light, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams that cut through the gaps in the boards. Thomas woke with a stiff neck and a heavy heart. He checked on the wounded man, still breathing, though barely. His fever had risen, and his lips were dry and cracked. Thomas mixed some herbs his late wife used to use for pain and laid the damp cloth on the man's forehead. "You're gonna pull through, boy," he said quietly. "Don't make me regret this." By afternoon, the ranch felt uneasy. The cattle were restless, dogs barking at the wind, and every sound seemed sharper than usual. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the wide horizon. The plains stretched endlessly, golden and empty, but something in his gut told him he wasn't alone. As dusk fell again, Thomas returned to the barn. The young man stirred, whispering weakly. His hand trembled, pointing toward the north hills. "They come," he murmured. Then he went still. Thomas froze, his heart pounding. "They? Who's Kuman?" he asked, but no answer came. The rancher stood there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. Somewhere far off, a faint rumble echoed a low, rolling thunder. But as he listened closer, Thomas realized it wasn't thunder at all. It was the sound of distant hooves. The following morning broke with an uneasy calm. The sun rose red through the haze, a warning painted across the sky. Thomas stood on his porch with a cup of black coffee, staring at the plains that stretched endlessly before him. The world felt too still, no bird calls, no cattle lowing, not even the hum of the windmill. Only silence. It was the kind of quiet that made a man's instincts wake up. He set the cup down slowly, his eyes narrowing toward the northern hills. The sound came first soft, rhythmic, distant hooves, dozens of them. maybe hundreds. Thomas's jaw tightened. He reached for his rifle, resting by the door, and loaded around with trembling hands. "Lord help me," he muttered. He stepped out into the yard, squinting against the sun. On the horizon, a dark line moved like a living shadow. As the shapes grew clearer, his stomach turned cold. Riders, a whole column of them, spread wide across the open plain. Horses kicking up trails of dust that shimmered in the morning light by the time they reached the ridge overlooking his ranch. Thomas could see the glint of sunlight on spears and rifles. The Apache tribemen, women, even a few young riders had come in force. He counted at least 50. The lead rider broke away from the rest, galloping ahead with purpose. Thomas could see his painted face, now white stripes across his cheeks, feathers braided into his dark hair. The man rode tall and proud, like someone born in the saddle. Thomas's pulse thundered. He thought of the wounded man still lying in his barn, unconscious and fevered. Maybe this was his family. Or maybe they thought Thomas had harmed him. Either way, he was trapped, one rancher alone against a sea of riders. He lowered the rifle slightly, forcing his voice to stay calm as the lead rider slowed to a stop 20 yards away. The man's horse snorted, its muscles gleaming with sweat. The Apache's eyes, sharp and unreadable, met Thomas's across the dusty yard. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the man dismounted. He took a slow step forward, his hand resting on the knife at his side. Thomas's throat felt dry as sand. "I don't want trouble," he called out. "Your man, he's hurt. I found him by the creek, gave him water. He's in the barn." The Apache studied him in silence. His gaze shifted toward the barn, where a faint moan carried through the open door. Then he looked back at Thomas. The silence stretched so long that Thomas almost raised the rifle again, but then the warrior nodded once. A sharp signal. Behind him, a group of riders dismounted and moved toward the barn. Thomas didn't move. His heart pounded as he watched them disappear inside. The moments that followed felt like hours. Then one of the warriors shouted something in Apache, a cry that carried relief, not anger. The leader turned back toward Thomas, his expression softer now, though still guarded. He placed a hand over his chest and spoke, his voice deep and steady. "You give water," he said in broken English. "You save him." Thomas swallowed hard, lowering his rifle completely. "Did what any man oughta," he said quietly. The leader looked at him for another long moment before nodding again. He lifted his hand toward the horizon, where the tribe waited on horseback. Within minutes, the plains came alive with motion riders moving down toward the ranch, gathering around the barn like a tide of color and dust. The ground trembled with their arrival. The air filled with the snorts of horses and the rattle of beads. Thomas stood still, his heart thudding as the full tribe surrounded his home. The leader turned to him once more and said, "You will come. Speak with Chief." Thomas hesitated, then nodded slowly. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The sun was high by the time the dust settled around the ranch. The Apache riders had dismounted, forming a wide circle around the barn. Their horses stood still, snorting and restless, their eyes flashing in the light. Thomas could feel the weight of 100 eyes on him, stern, silent, and watchful. He'd never seen so many riders in one place, and every instinct told him to run. But his legs felt rooted to the ground. The wounded man had been carried out of the barn on a makeshift stretcher of hides and poles. He looked fragile, his skin pale beneath streaks of dried blood. Women gathered around him, tending to his wounds with gentle hands and murmured words. The leader who had spoken to Thomas earlier, tall, lean, and proud, now stood beside another man, older, broad-shouldered, with hair as silver as the river under moonlight. His eyes, dark and calm, seemed to see through everything, even fear. This was the chief. The leader motioned for Thomas to step forward. Thomas swallowed hard, resting his rifle against the porch post, and walked slowly toward the circle. The riders parted slightly, letting him through. Every movement felt like a test, every breath heavy. He stopped a few paces from the chief and removed his hat in respect. "Name's Thomas Hale," he said quietly. "I'm the one who found your man." The chief didn't answer at first. He studied Thomas for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice deep and measured. "You find him. You give water. Why?" Thomas hesitated, searching for words. "Because he was dying," he said finally, "and I couldn't just leave him out there." The chief nodded slowly, as if weighing the truth of that answer. "Many white men do not help," he said. "Many take, burn, kill. You give." Thomas felt the sting of shame in his chest. "I've seen enough death," he said softly. "Didn't want to add to it." The chief exchanged a few quiet words with his people, their language flowing like wind through grass. The tall warrior beside him, apparently the wounded man's brother, watched Thomas with eyes full of both suspicion and gratitude. Then the chief looked back at him. "The one you help," he said, pointing to the stretcher, "is my son." Thomas blinked, taken aback. Your son?" The chief nodded once, slowly. "He hunted with 2 men, attacked by men from town, shot, chased. He ran far. We follow his trail. We find you." A heavy silence fell between them. Thomas realized what that meant. If he hadn't stopped by the creek that night, the chief's son would have died alone. And this tribe might have come seeking vengeance instead of peace. The chief stepped closer, his shadow falling over Thomas. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the chief extended his hand, a gesture of respect, of balance. Thomas hesitated, then took it firmly. The grip was strong, steady. "You have honor," the chief said. "You are not like others." Thomas nodded. "And you have my word, I meant no harm." The chief turned to his people and spoke in Apache. A few of them nodded. Others still looked uncertain. The tension began to ease, like a knot slowly loosening. The wounded son was lifted carefully onto a horse-drawn litter. Before they left, the chief looked at Thomas again and said, "You gave life. The land will remember." Then he turned and mounted his horse, raising his hand toward the hills. The riders began to move, their shadows long and ghostly against the golden grass dot as they rode away. Thomas stood alone in the dust, the echo of their hooves fading into the horizon. He didn't know it yet, but the choice he'd made by the creek would change his life forever. 2 days passed after the tribe's departure, but the dust they left behind still seemed to hang over the ranch like a ghost. The land felt quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It was heavier, like the calm after a storm that had changed everything. Thomas spent those days mending fences and tending to his cattle, trying to pretend life was normal. But no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were still watching him from somewhere beyond the hills. The story had spread faster than wildfire. Someone from the trading post must have seen the riders that morning, because by the time Thomas rode into town for supplies, people were already talking. The moment he tied his horse outside the general store, the whispers started. "That's him," someone muttered. "The fool who sheltered a savage." Another voice hissed, "Ain't right, helping them after what they'd done last year." Thomas kept his head down, his jaw tight, pretending not to hear. But the looks that followed him were sharp enough to cut. Inside the store, Old Man Riggs, the shopkeeper, greeted him with a nervous smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mornin', Tom," he said cautiously. "Heard you had some visitors up your way?" Thomas loaded his basket with flour and coffee. "Word travels quick," he said flatly. "Hard not to notice when a whole tribe rides through," Riggs replied. "You sure it was wise, bringing one of them into your barn?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He stared at the counter, then said he was dying. Didn't see color or tribe, just a man who needed help. Riggs sighed, shaking his head. "You always had more heart than sense." When Thomas stepped outside, 3 men stood near his horse ranch hands from the neighboring property. Big men, sunburned and rough around the edges. Their leader, Clay Morton, was a bully Thomas had known for years. "Heard you been playin' nurse to an Apache," Clay sneered. "What's next? You gonna invite the whole tribe to supper?" Thomas set his basket down slowly. "Don't start, Clay." Clay spat in the dirt. "You bring trouble on all of us, Hale. You give one of 'em a drink, next thing they'll come for our cattle or worse." Thomas stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "They already came, and they left in peace. Because I showed a little decency, something you wouldn't understand." Clay's grin faded. "You callin' me indecent?" Thomas met his eyes. "If the boot fits." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Clay shoved him hard. Thomas stumbled, but didn't fall. His hand hovered near his holster, but he didn't draw. "Go home, Clay," he said quietly. "Ain't worth it." Clay smirked. "One day you'll wish you'd stayed on your own side of the line." He mounted his horse and rode off with his men, leaving dust and tension behind. Back at the ranch, Thomas sat on the porch under the stars, listening to the wind. He knew the town would talk, maybe even turn on him, but deep down, he didn't regret what he'd done. Somewhere out there, a young man was alive because of it. Somewhere, a chief had told his people that not all white men were cruel. Maybe that was worth whatever price came with it. The breeze carried a faint sound through the night, a soft rhythm of hooves far in the distance. Thomas smiled faintly, tipping his hat. "Ride safe, friends," he murmured. The sound faded into the darkness, and for the first time in a long while, the land around him felt at peace.